What if the universe doesn't merely exist around you, but responds to you? What if every sincere question you've ever asked, every quiet moment of wondering, every restless curiosity, was not ignored, but answered, not with clarity, but with more complexity? What if reality itself deepens when you look closer, like a landscape that grows more detailed the farther you walk into it? Think about the first time you realized the world was larger than you were told. Maybe it was when the night sky stopped being a ceiling and became a depth, or when time stopped feeling like a straight line and began to feel elastic, strange, almost alive. That moment when a simple explanation broke, and instead of relief, you felt unease. A sense that learning did not simplify the universe, but made it heavier, denser, stranger. We're taught from childhood that knowledge is a light, that understanding clears the darkness, that questions lead to answers, and answers bring peace. But that is not how it actually feels, is it? In real life, every genuine answer seems to open 5 new questions. Every solved mystery leaves behind a deeper one, humming quietly beneath the surface. The atom was supposed to be the final brick. Then, it shattered into particles. Those particles dissolved into fields. Those fields blurred into probabilities. And now we speak in the language of equations, so abstract they feel closer to spells than descriptions. The more we learn, the less solid reality becomes. And yet, something even stranger is happening. As our understanding deepens, the universe does not flatten into simplicity. It unfolds. It reveals layers, like a book that writes new chapters only after you've read the previous ones. Telescopes sharpen, and the cosmos doesn't become emptier, it becomes more crowded. Microscopes improve, and matter doesn't become smoother. It becomes restless, vibrating, uncertain. Each increase in resolution exposes not an endpoint, but an edge. Why does reality behave like this? Why does the universe feel as though it is structured to resist final understanding, while simultaneously rewarding curiosity with deeper access? Why does every boundary we reach feel less like a wall, and more like a gate? Consider how strange it is that the universe is even understandable at all, that mathematics, an invention of the human mind, maps so cleanly onto the behavior of stars, atoms, and light, that equations written on paper can predict eclipses, particle collisions, and the bending of space-time itself. It's as if the universe is written in a language we are somehow learning to read. But here is the unsettling part. The language becomes more complex the more fluent we become. At the beginning, reality speaks in simple sentences. Objects fall, fire burns, time passes. But as we listen more carefully, the grammar shifts. Time stretches, space curves, particles exist in many states at once. Causes no longer neatly precede effects. The universe stops explaining itself like a story and starts behaving like a puzzle that rearranges itself as you solve it. This does not feel accidental. In video games, early levels are simple. Clear goals, limited environments, few rules. But as the player progresses, the world expands. New mechanics appear. The map opens. Hidden areas unlock. The game becomes harder, not to punish the player, but because the player is now capable of handling more complexity. And sometimes, the most unsettling moment is not the final boss, but the realization that the game knew how far you would go. So, we must ask the uncomfortable question. Does reality do something similar? Not in a literal sense, perhaps, but in structure, in behavior. In the way deeper inquiry seems to summon deeper strangeness, the universe does not collapse into simplicity under scrutiny. It resists, it complicates, it reveals hidden dimensions of law, symmetry, and abstraction that were invisible before. It's almost as if curiosity itself is a key, one that unlocks new layers of reality while quietly locking the door behind you. Because once you see these layers, you cannot unsee them. The sky never goes back to being just the sky. Time never returns to being just a clock. Even the self begins to feel unstable, an emergent pattern rather than a solid thing. Knowledge does not merely add facts to your mind, it changes the texture of existence. The universe feels less like a place you inhabit, and more like a process you are inside of. Physics tells us something deeply unsettling. Observation is not passive. At the smallest scales, to observe a system is to disturb it. Measurement changes outcomes. Possibilities collapse into facts, not before, but because they are observed. Reality at its foundation does not fully decide what it is until it is asked the right question in the right way. That should haunt us more than it does. Because if observation shapes reality, then curiosity is not innocent. It is an action, a pressure, a force. When we look deeper, reality responds, not by yielding clarity, but by rearranging itself into more elaborate forms. The universe doesn't say, "Here is the answer." It says, "If you want to continue, you must learn a new language." And we do, again and again. From classical mechanics to relativity. From relativity to quantum mechanics. From quantum mechanics to theories so abstract they exist more comfortably in higher dimensional mathematics than in imagination. Each time we think we are nearing bedrock, the ground gives way beneath us. Why is the bottom always missing? One possibility is randomness, that the universe simply has no final layer, that complexity is endless and meaningless. But this explanation feels thin, because the complexity we encounter is not chaotic. It is structured, elegant, constrained, governed by principles that feel discovered, not invented. There is an order to the madness, a consistency to the strangeness. Another possibility is more unsettling, that the universe is not built to be fully known, not because it is hiding something malicious, but because complete knowledge might be incompatible with the kind of beings we are. Or perhaps because the act of knowing is itself part of the universe's unfolding. When you learn something profound, you feel it in your body, a tightening in the chest, a quiet vertigo, a sense that something has shifted permanently. This is not just intellectual, it is existential. To understand is to change, and to change is to leave something behind. Maybe that is why reality reveals itself slowly, in layers, like trust, because trust is earned, and so is access. Throughout history, every leap in understanding has come with fear. The realization that Earth is not the center of the cosmos shattered humanity's sense of importance. The discovery that time is relative destabilized the idea of a universal now. The quantum revolution made certainty itself suspect. Each breakthrough didn't just add knowledge, it wounded old intuitions. It forced us to grow into a stranger worldview. And yet, we kept going. Why? Why do we continue to ask questions that unsettle us? Why do we peer into depths that make us feel small, temporary, and uncertain? Why does curiosity persist even when it costs us comfort? Perhaps because something in us recognizes something in the universe, a shared pattern, a resonance, as if consciousness itself is tuned to complexity, drawn toward it the way gravity draws matter together, as if the universe and the mind are engaged in a quiet dialogue, one asking questions, the other responding with increasing intricacy. This documentary begins here, at that uneasy threshold, at the moment where curiosity stops feeling like a hobby and starts feeling like a calling, or a test, or a trap. Because if the universe truly does reward curiosity with more complexity, then the reward is not ease, it is depth. And depth is not safe. Depth means pressure. It means darkness. It means transformation. And once you step into that depth, there is no simple way back. So ask yourself, honestly, before we go any further, do you want reality to make sense? Or do you want to see it as it actually is? Because those two desires are not the same, and the universe, it seems, knows the difference. Have you ever noticed how the universe feels quiet until you pay attention to it? Not silent, never silent, but dormant, like a vast machine idling in the dark, waiting for a signal. The moment you begin to truly look, to truly ask, something subtle shifts. Patterns emerge where there was once noise. Coincidences begin to cluster. Questions start answering themselves with more questions, as if reality senses your interest and decides to lean closer. Why does attention feel like an invitation? In physics, attention has a technical name, observation. And observation, disturbingly, is never neutral. At the smallest scales of existence, particles do not simply exist with fixed properties. They exist as possibilities, as clouds of potential states. Only when measured, when interacted with, do they settle into something definite. It is not that reality hides its answers, it is that reality waits. It waits for interaction. It waits for inquiry. It waits for curiosity to knock. This is not philosophy drifting into metaphor. This is measurement theory. This is quantum mechanics whispering something deeply uncomfortable. The universe behaves differently when it is watched. Think about that for a moment. not emotionally, mechanically. The universe has rules that only activate under scrutiny, as if the act of asking a question is itself part of the equation, as if curiosity is not just a trait of conscious beings, but a force that shapes outcomes. And yet, this phenomenon doesn't stay confined to the quantum realm. It echoes upward into the large-scale structure of reality, into cosmology, into the human experience of learning itself. The more carefully we observe the universe, the more it seems to reveal layers that were not apparent before, not randomly, not chaotically, but in a way that feels staged, progressive, conditional, almost responsive. At first, the universe presents itself simply: matter, motion, cause and effect. But when we refine our questions, when we sharpen our tools, the universe does not simplify further. It fractures into complexity. Time becomes relative. Space becomes flexible. Matter dissolves into energy. Energy dissolves into fields. Fields dissolve into probabilities. And probabilities dissolve into mathematical structures that exist nowhere except the human mind. Why does deeper observation lead to abstraction instead of clarity? Why does the universe retreat into mathematics the closer we get to its foundations? One explanation is that mathematics is simply the language of reality. But language implies communication, and communication implies an audience. The unsettling implication is not that math describes the universe, but that the universe allows itself to be described in layers, as if testing whether we are capable of understanding the next level of syntax. Every scientific revolution feels like a threshold moment. Before it, the world feels stable. After it, nothing fits the old map. People don't just learn new facts, they must relearn how to think. The earth moves. Time bends. Observation interferes. Certainty erodes. Each breakthrough makes the universe feel less human-scaled, less intuitive, and yet strangely more intimate. Because these discoveries are not distant. They don't just affect stars and particles. They affect you, your sense of time, your sense of identity, your sense of place. Once you understand that time is not universal, you can never fully trust the clock again. Once you understand that matter is mostly empty space, solidity feels like an illusion. Once you understand that your thoughts arise from electrical patterns, the self becomes less like a soul and more like a process. Knowledge does not leave the observer unchanged. It rearranges the observer from the inside. So perhaps the universe reveals complexity in response to curiosity, because curiosity itself is transformative. Not everyone can withstand deeper truth. Not everyone wants to. Simpler realities are easier to inhabit. Clear stories, fixed meanings, solid ground. But curiosity erodes solid ground. It pushes you into ambiguity, into unresolved questions, into paradox. It asks you to live without final answers. And yet, something in us keeps pushing forward anyway, as if driven by a hunger older than culture, older than language. Look at the history of human thought. Every civilization that reached a certain level of curiosity encountered the same unsettling pattern. Myths gave way to models. Models gave way to equations. Equations gave way to abstractions so removed from daily experience that they could only be trusted, not visualized. And at every stage, the universe did not close itself off. It opened further, but at a cost. Each layer demanded a new kind of mind. Classical physics required intuition. Relativity required surrendering common sense. Quantum mechanics required accepting contradiction. Modern cosmology requires comfort with scales so vast and so small that the human brain cannot emotionally process them. The universe did not stop us, but it did not make it easy. This raises a quiet, dangerous thought. Maybe the universe is not trying to be understood all at once. Maybe understanding is something that must be grown into, step by step, with complexity increasing as capacity increases. Like weight added gradually to a structure, testing whether it can hold. If that is true, then curiosity is not a passive trait. It is a stress test, a probe, a way of applying pressure to reality and seeing what gives. And reality gives, but only partially. Consider the cosmic horizons that appear everywhere we look. There are limits beyond which we cannot see, not because of technological failure, but because of the structure of space-time itself. Light has only had so much time to travel. Information has speed limits. Certain regions of the universe are permanently inaccessible, sealed off by expansion. Even at the smallest scales, we encounter similar boundaries. There are limits to precision, limits to measurement, limits to simultaneous knowledge. No matter how refined our tools become, some uncertainties remain baked into the fabric of existence. These limits are strangely consistent. They feel less like accidents and more like rules. Rules that say, you may look this far, you may know this much. Beyond that, the universe becomes statistical, indirect, inferred. And yet, within those limits, the universe becomes richer the more closely we examine it. Galaxies within galaxies, structures within structures, patterns repeating at different scales, complexity blooming wherever curiosity lingers. It's hard not to feel that this is intentional. Not in a conscious sense, perhaps, but in a structural one, as if reality is designed to be explored, but not consumed all at once, as if it unfolds in response to engagement, not conquest. Think about how a conversation works. You don't reveal your deepest thoughts to someone who isn't listening. You respond to interest with depth, to care with nuance, to persistence with honesty. A shallow question gets a shallow answer. A deep question invites a longer pause. What if the universe behaves the same way? What if complexity is not a wall, but a response? If so, then curiosity is not about collecting facts. It is about relationship. A dialogue between the observer and the observed, between consciousness and cosmos, between the questioner and the question itself. And like all deep dialogues, it changes both sides. The universe becomes stranger as we study it, but we also become stranger to ourselves. Our certainties dissolve, our identities loosen. We begin to suspect that we are not standing outside reality, analyzing it, but embedded within it, participating in its unfolding. This is where awe turns into unease, because if the universe responds to curiosity, then it is not indifferent. And if it is not indifferent, then our questions matter in ways we have not fully reckoned with. Perhaps curiosity is not just a human impulse. Perhaps it is how the universe explores itself through us. A feedback loop where awareness generates complexity, and complexity generates deeper awareness. And if that loop continues indefinitely, then there may be no final answer waiting at the end. Only deeper questions, deeper structures, deeper transformations, which leads us to the next unsettling step. If reality reveals more complexity the more we learn, does it ever stop? Or are we moving towards something that cannot be fully grasped, only approached layer by layer, until the question itself changes who we are? Why does complexity arrive in layers instead of all at once? Why does understanding feel less like uncovering a hidden object and more like descending through floors of a structure that never seems to end? You would think that if reality had a core, a final mechanism, we would eventually reach it. That knowledge would converge, that explanations would simplify as we moved closer to the truth. But the opposite keeps happening. The deeper we go, the more elaborate the machinery becomes. This pattern is not subtle. It appears everywhere. Look outward. Early astronomers saw points of light. Then those points became suns. Then suns became galaxies. Then galaxies arranged themselves into filaments and voids, vast structures stretching across unimaginable distances like a cosmic nervous system. Empty space was supposed to be nothing. Instead, it turned out to be restless, energetic, expanding, accelerating. The more carefully we measured the universe, the more structure it revealed. Hidden beneath what once looked like simplicity, now look inward. The human body once seemed straightforward. Organs, blood, bone, then came cells, then molecules, then DNA, a language encoded in chemistry, then epigenetics, where experience itself leaves marks on biology, then neural networks, feedback loops, emergent consciousness. At no point did complexity collapse into a clean foundation. It kept branching, deepening, interlocking. Why does reality refuse to reduce itself? One explanation is that complexity is fundamental, that there is no bottom layer, only endless structure nested within structure. But even this idea does not fully satisfy, because the complexity we encounter is not arbitrary. It is constrained, elegant, governed by rules that feel carefully balanced. Change one constant slightly, and stars never form. Change another, and chemistry collapses. The universe exists in a narrow corridor where complexity is possible at all. That corridor feels intentional, not in motive, but in architecture. It is as if reality is tuned to allow layered discovery, as if each layer only becomes meaningful when the previous one is understood well enough to support it. You cannot grasp quantum mechanics without abandoning classical intuition. You cannot grasp relativity without letting go of absolute time. Each step requires a psychological evolution, not just an intellectual one. Understanding does not just add information, it demands sacrifice. You must give up the comfort of certainty, the feeling that the world behaves the way it looks, the idea that intuition is a reliable guide. Learning rewires perception. It changes what feels real. And because of that, knowledge cannot be given all at once. It must be earned, absorbed, metabolized. Imagine if a child were suddenly shown the full mathematical description of space-time, not explained, just revealed. It would be meaningless, not because it is false, but because the mind is not yet structured to receive it. Complexity without preparation is indistinguishable from chaos. So, reality seems to pace itself. It reveals just enough to invite further inquiry, but not so much that the system collapses under the weight of its own understanding. Each layer acts as a filter, a gatekeeper, a test of whether the observer is capable of moving further without losing coherence. This is not mystical. It is structural. In information theory, complexity must be encoded efficiently to be transmitted. Too much information at once becomes noise. Too little becomes trivial. Meaning lives in the balance. The universe appears to operate in that same balance, offering complexity gradually, in a way that can be integrated by minds that persist. And persistence matters. Curiosity is not a single question. It is sustained attention over time. It is the willingness to remain with uncertainty without demanding immediate closure. Most people turn away at the first sign of discomfort. They want answers that restore stability. They want stories that end. But reality does not seem interested in endings, only in continuations. Those who keep going begin to notice something else. Complexity does not just increase in quantity, it increases in depth. Explanations stop being mechanical and start becoming relational. Things are no longer defined by what they are, but by how they interact. Particles by their fields, fields by their symmetries, symmetries by mathematical invariance. The universe becomes less like a machine and more like a network of constraints, a choreography of relationships. At that point, understanding starts to feel less like seeing objects and more like sensing patterns. This is where many people feel lost, because pattern recognition requires surrender. You cannot hold on to fixed images. You must allow abstraction. You must trust structures you cannot visualize. You must accept that reality is not obligated to feel intuitive. And yet, those who cross this threshold often report something unexpected. Not despair, not confusion, but a strange kind of awe, a sense that the universe is deeper than fear, that complexity is not an enemy, but a signal that there is more to engage with. Think about how mastery works in any domain: music, language, mathematics. At first, complexity feels overwhelming. Then, slowly patterns emerge. What once felt chaotic becomes expressive. Nuance appears. Depth replaces noise. The domain does not become simpler. You become more capable. What if reality itself operates this way? What if the universe does not simplify because it is not meant to be simplified? What if it is meant to be inhabited at increasing levels of sophistication? What if curiosity is not about reaching an endpoint, but about evolving into a form that can dwell comfortably within deeper complexity? This reframes everything. It suggests that the universe is not withholding answers. It is offering invitations. Each layer of understanding is an invitation to change how you think, how you perceive, how you relate to existence itself. The reward is not certainty. It is expansion. But expansion comes with risk. Because as complexity increases, so does the possibility of error, of misinterpretation, of losing your footing. Abstractions can detach from experience. Models can become idols. One can mistake the map for the territory and get lost inside equations that no longer connect to lived reality. This may be why boundaries exist, why horizons appear, why uncertainty cannot be eliminated. They act as stabilizers, reminders that no model is complete, that no layer is final. That humility must accompany insight. The universe seems to enforce this humility. Whenever we think we have reached a final explanation, cracks appear, an anomaly, a paradox, a discrepancy too persistent to ignore. And that discrepancy becomes the doorway to the next layer, the next expansion of complexity, the next demand on the mind. It is tempting to ask whether this process ever ends, whether there is a final layer where all questions collapse into one answer. But perhaps that question misunderstands the nature of the system. Perhaps there is no final layer because reality is not a thing to be solved, but a process to be participated in, a structure that grows richer through engagement, a dialogue that deepens with attention. If that is true, then complexity is not a barrier. It is a signal that you are moving in the right direction. But it also means something else, something unsettling. If reality reveals itself in layers only to those who persist, then not everyone inhabits the same universe. Not experientially, not perceptually. Two people can occupy the same physical space and yet live in entirely different realities, separated by depth of understanding, by tolerance for ambiguity, by willingness to keep asking. The universe you experience is shaped by the questions you are able to hold, and that brings us to a dangerous realization. If complexity is unlocked by curiosity, then curiosity is not neutral. It changes the world you perceive. It moves you into regions of reality that others may never enter. And once there, the old explanations no longer work. So the question is no longer whether complexity exists. The question is whether you are willing to live with it. What if the universe does not reveal everything at once, because it is not fully there all at once? What if reality itself sharpens only where it is touched, like an image loading detail only where the eye lingers? This idea feels unsettling because it challenges something deeply comforting, the belief that the world exists independently, completely, whether we look at it or not. Yet again and again, physics whispers a different story. There are edges to what can be known, not because we lack intelligence, but because reality seems structured around thresholds, event horizons beyond which information cannot return, quantum limits beyond which precision dissolves. Even space-time itself appears pixelated at the smallest scales, as if there is a fundamental resolution to existence. Resolution. That word alone should make us pause. Resolution implies limits not of truth, but of display, of rendering, of how much detail can be shown before the system changes behavior. When you zoom too far in, the image does not simply become clearer. It breaks into noise, probabilities, abstractions. Reality does not let you look infinitely close. It redirects you, as if saying, "This is not how you are meant to see." We often assume that the universe is like a completed painting, hanging in a gallery, fully detailed everywhere at once. But what if it is more like a performance, unfolding only where attention goes? Not staged for an audience, but co-created through interaction. Not static, but conditional. Consider space itself. For centuries, it was thought to be an empty stage where matter moved. Then we learned that space can stretch, bend, ripple, that it carries energy, that it expands faster the farther you look. Empty space is not empty. It is active, dynamic, responsive. Responsive to what? To mass, to energy, to observation, to scale. The closer we examine space, the more rules it seems to have. The farther we look, the more surprising its behavior becomes. Expansion accelerates. Galaxies flee from each other. Dark energy dominates, unseen yet overwhelming. The universe does not simplify at large scales. It becomes stranger, and the same pattern repeats at small scales. Particles do not have definite positions until measured. They exist as waves of possibility, probability clouds, mathematical expectations. When you attempt to pin them down, they respond, not by revealing themselves, but by changing. The act of measurement forces a choice the system did not previously make. This is not a metaphor. It is experimentally verified. Reality, at its foundation, behaves as if it is incomplete until interaction occurs. That sentence should not sit comfortably in your mind. Because if reality requires interaction to finalize its state, then observation is not passive, it is participatory. The universe is not merely observed, it is engaged. This has led some physicists to suggest that information is more fundamental than matter, that bits, not particles, form the bedrock of existence. That reality is not built from things, but from answers to yes or no questions, from distinctions, from data. And data is meaningless without a context that asks for it. So we arrive at a disturbing possibility, not that the universe is a simulation in the simplistic sense, but that it behaves like a system optimized for interaction, like a structure that reveals detail only when required, like a world that saves its complexity for those who approach it closely enough. Think about how strange that is. The universe is nearly 14 billion years old, vast beyond comprehension. And yet, its deepest laws only reveal themselves through minds that evolved on a small planet, in a narrow band of conditions, asking very specific questions with very specific tools. It is as if reality waited until a certain threshold of curiosity was reached before unlocking deeper layers of itself. Before telescopes, there were no galaxies. Experientially, before microscopes, no cells. Before mathematics, no space-time curvature. Before quantum theory, no probability amplitudes. These things may have existed in some abstract sense, but they did not exist as part of the human universe. And that distinction matters, because the universe you live in is not just the physical one. It is the interpreted one, the one filtered through perception, language, theory, and belief. Reality as experienced is not fixed. It evolves as understanding evolves, which means reality is not just discovered, it is expanded. This does not mean humans create the universe, but it may mean that the universe contains many possible descriptions, many possible depths, and which one you inhabit depends on how far you are willing or able to go. The more advanced our instruments become, the more the universe retreats into abstraction, into math, into structures that cannot be pictured, only trusted, extra dimensions curled up too small to see, fields vibrating in spaces we cannot imagine, particles that are not really particles at all. At some point, explanation stops being visual and becomes symbolic. This feels like a kind of initiation, as if the universe is testing whether you can let go of the need to see in order to understand, whether you can trade images for equations, stories for structures, intuition for consistency, and many cannot. This is where the idea of rendering becomes powerful, not as a claim, but as a lens. When we ask why reality behaves this way, why it becomes more abstract the deeper we look, one answer stands out. Because abstraction is efficient. Because complexity must be compressed to be navigable. Because deeper layers require different interfaces. You cannot access advanced systems with beginner tools. So, reality upgrades its interface as you upgrade your questions. This would explain why every leap in understanding feels like entering a new world. Why scientists often describe breakthroughs as moments of disorientation, even dread. Why the universe suddenly feels unfamiliar, as if the rules have changed. They have. But only because you crossed a boundary. If this is true, then curiosity is not about collecting truths. It is about unlocking access. Each layer of understanding is like a clearance level. The deeper you go, the more abstract, demanding, and alien reality becomes. And here is the most unsettling part. If reality reveals complexity conditionally, then ignorance is not just a lack of knowledge. It is a different world, a simpler one, a more stable one, perhaps even a kinder one. But simplicity comes at a cost. It limits depth. It limits connection. It limits the range of meaning available to you. So the universe presents a choice without ever stating it outright. Remain in the surface world, where explanations are comfortable and stories end. Or continue downward, where every answer dissolves into deeper questions, where certainty fades, but awe intensifies. This is not a moral choice. It is an existential one, and it leads directly to the next realization, one that feels almost dangerous to articulate. If reality reveals deeper layers only when engaged, then knowledge itself may function like a trigger, a mechanism that not only explains the universe, but reshapes it. Which means the act of knowing may carry consequences far beyond understanding. That is where we go next. At some point, curiosity stops feeling like a gift and starts feeling like a burden. The questions no longer sparkle with excitement. They press, they linger, they follow you into silence. You begin to notice that every answer carries a cost, and that cost is never paid in information alone. It is paid in comfort. There is a moment, quiet, internal, often unspoken, when a person realizes that learning does not satisfy curiosity. It sharpens it. It refines it into something more demanding. Something that no longer wants closure, only continuation. Knowledge, once tasted deeply, becomes hunger. Why does this happen? Why doesn't understanding feel like arrival? In theory, learning should resolve uncertainty. In practice, it destabilizes it. Each explanation exposes the limits of the explanation before it. Each model reveals the cracks in the model itself. You climb, expecting a summit, only to discover another ridge rising ahead of you, steeper than the last. This is not accidental. It is structural. Every time we think we've found solid ground, reality reminds us that the ground itself is floating. Newton's laws worked beautifully, until they didn't. Relativity corrected them, until it encountered the quantum. Quantum theory explained the small, until it collided with gravity. Each framework is not wrong, but incomplete. Each truth contains the seed of its own insufficiency. And the deeper you go, the more this pattern becomes personal. At first, curiosity feels empowering. You feel smarter, more aware, more awake. But slowly, subtly, the weight increases. You begin to see how fragile certainty is, how provisional every explanation must be, how easily meaning dissolves under scrutiny. The world stops feeling stable. Even your own thoughts feel less anchored than before. This is where many people turn back. Not because they are incapable, but because they sense the cost. Because to continue is to accept that there may be no final story that makes everything neat. That meaning might not be handed down from above, but assembled moment by moment, under conditions of uncertainty. Curiosity asks for courage, and not the loud kind. The quiet kind. The kind that sits with unanswered questions without numbing itself. The kind that resists the temptation to simplify prematurely. Because simplification is seductive. It promises relief. It promises orientation. It promises a sense of being done. But simplification often achieves peace by shrinking reality to fit our comfort, rather than expanding ourselves to meet reality where it actually is. The universe does not seem to reward that move. Again and again, it withholds depth from those who demand certainty too quickly. It offers slogans instead of structures, appearances instead of mechanisms, stories instead of systems. But to those who linger, who tolerate confusion long enough for patterns to emerge, it offers something far rarer. Not answers, but access. This is where curiosity becomes dangerous, because access changes you. Once you glimpse deeper structures, you cannot pretend they are not there. You cannot fully return to surface explanations. You may function within them, but you no longer believe them completely. This creates a quiet loneliness. You begin to notice that many conversations stop where your questions begin. That many explanations feel too thin, too eager to conclude. You feel the absence of depth, like a pressure in the room. Not because others are wrong, but because they are finished asking where you are not. The universe mirrors this experience. At surface levels, it feels friendly, predictable, familiar. But the deeper you push, the less it seems interested in reassurance. It offers elegance instead of comfort, consistency instead of clarity, beauty that does not explain itself. Mathematics becomes the language of this deeper realm, not because it is cold, but because it is precise. It does not care how you feel. It only cares whether relationships hold. And the universe, at depth, seems to care about relationships above all else. Particles are not things, they are interactions. Time is not a flow, it is a relation between events. Space is not a container, it is a network of distances defined by mass and energy. Even identity becomes relational, a pattern maintained over time, not a fixed core. This is unsettling because it dissolves the idea of permanence, and permanence is what the human mind craves most. We want foundations that do not move, truths that do not expire, meanings that do not depend on perspective. But the universe does not appear to be built that way. It appears to be built for change, for emergence, for continual reconfiguration. The more deeply we understand this, the more the old comforts fail. And yet, strangely, something else begins to grow in their place, a different kind of peace. Not the peace of certainty, but the peace of coherence. The realization that even without final answers, the universe holds together. That despite its strangeness, it is not arbitrary. That patterns persist even when interpretations change. This is the trap and the gift of knowing. You lose the illusion of solidity, but you gain a sense of participation. You stop seeing yourself as a spectator and start sensing yourself as a thread woven into a much larger fabric. Your questions no longer feel external to reality. they feel like movements within it, which raises an unsettling possibility. What if curiosity itself is part of the universe's structure? What if the drive to know is not an accident of evolution, but a function? A way the cosmos folds back on itself, generating awareness through localized centers of inquiry? In that case, curiosity is not just hunger, it is feedback. And feedback systems do not stabilize by satisfying desire. They stabilize by increasing complexity until a new equilibrium is reached, until the system changes form. Perhaps that is why knowledge never feels complete, because completion would stop the process. And the universe, it seems, is not interested in stopping. This reframes the discomfort of knowing, the anxiety, the unease, the sense of standing on shifting ground. These are not signs of failure, they are signs of transition, of crossing from one level of engagement to another. The universe does not punish curiosity, it stretches it. But stretching has limits. If you pull too hard, too fast, coherence breaks. Models fracture. Meaning collapses into noise. This may be why the deepest questions are not answered quickly. Why progress feels slow. Why confusion persists for decades, sometimes centuries, before clarity emerges. Reality seems to protect itself, and us, from overload, which suggests that complexity is not just revealed, it is regulated. And that leads us to a deeper suspicion. If the universe controls how complexity is revealed, if it paces understanding, if it enforces limits and horizons, then curiosity may be interacting with something that has its own rules, its own constraints, its own thresholds. Not a mind, not an intention, but a system. A system that responds. And once you see that possibility, it becomes impossible to ignore the next question. If curiosity triggers deeper complexity, what happens when curiosity becomes collective? What happens when curiosity is no longer isolated inside one mind, but synchronized across many? When questions are not whispered in solitude, but echoed through cultures, instruments, and generations, something remarkable and unsettling begins to occur. The universe doesn't just respond to individuals, it responds to momentum. History shows this clearly. There are moments when knowledge seems to accelerate, when discoveries arrive not as lone sparks, but as clusters. Calculus emerges in two minds at once. Evolution surfaces simultaneously across continents. Quantum theory blossoms through a network of thinkers who never fully agree, yet move in the same direction. It feels less like coincidence and more like alignment, as if reality opens certain doors only when enough pressure is applied. This is what collective curiosity looks like. Not chaos, but resonance. Many minds tuning themselves toward the same unknown, amplifying the signal. And when that happens, the universe does not merely offer small clarifications. It shifts paradigms. It reorganizes how reality is described, understood, and experienced. These moments feel destabilizing because they don't just add knowledge, they rearrange the world. Suddenly, the old language fails. Old metaphors break. Institutions resist. People argue not because they disagree on facts, but because they are standing in different realities. One still grounded in the previous layer, the other already stepping into the next. This is not progress in the comforting sense. It is rupture. When collective curiosity reaches a threshold, the universe seems to respond with complexity that no single mind could have handled alone. Entire frameworks are required. Entire generations must adapt. Education systems shift. Philosophies fracture. The meaning of truth itself comes under pressure. Think about how destabilizing it was to realize that Earth is not the center of the cosmos, or that humans are not separately created, but shaped by the same forces as every other organism, or that time does not pass equally for everyone. These were not just scientific updates, they were existential shocks, and they arrived only when curiosity reached a critical mass. This suggests something profound, that the universe does not simply reveal complexity when asked. It reveals it when asked collectively, persistently, and coherently. Like a system that only unlocks higher-level interactions once enough nodes are active. In network theory, systems behave differently when connectivity increases. Below a certain threshold, nothing happens. Above it, sudden order emerges. Patterns form. Phase transitions occur. Water freezes. Metals conduct. Crowds synchronize. What if understanding works the same way? What if the universe contains levels of complexity that only become accessible when consciousness itself reaches a certain density of inquiry? When enough minds are asking similar questions, refining similar tools, tolerating similar uncertainties. This would explain why some ideas feel ahead of their time, why they appear, fail, disappear, and then reappear decades later, suddenly understandable. The idea didn't change, the collective mind did. The universe didn't reveal something new. We became capable of receiving it. But this also introduces a darker possibility. If collective curiosity can unlock deeper layers of reality, then it can also destabilize existing ones. Complexity does not arrive gently. It arrives like a restructuring. Old meanings collapse. Old certainties lose authority. Social narratives fracture under the weight of new explanations. This is why periods of rapid knowledge expansion often coincide with anxiety, polarization, and cultural unrest. It is not just technology advancing, it is reality itself being reinterpreted faster than humans can emotionally adapt. The universe does not wait for psychological readiness. It responds to inquiry, not comfort. And now, for the first time in history, collective curiosity is operating at a planetary scale. Billions of minds connected, instruments probing the cosmos continuously, data flowing faster than interpretation, models evolving in real time, simulations predicting outcomes before they are felt. We are not just asking questions anymore. We are pressing on reality from every angle at once. What happens when a system is stressed this way? When feedback loops tighten? When complexity accelerates faster than meaning can stabilize? Some signs are already visible: information overload, epistemic uncertainty, competing models of truth, a growing sense that reality itself feels unstable, fragmented, difficult to agree upon. People argue not just about beliefs, but about what counts as real. This is not just social dysfunction. It may be a symptom of crossing another threshold. If curiosity unlocks complexity, then a surge of collective curiosity may unlock layers of reality that challenge the very frameworks we use to understand it. Not because reality is breaking, but because our interface with it is upgrading faster than our intuition can keep up. This is where fear enters, because complexity at this scale is not just abstract. It touches power, identity, survival. Technologies reshape biology. Algorithms influence perception. Models predict futures that feel disturbingly plausible. The universe, mediated through our tools, feels closer than ever, and harder to trust. And yet, pulling back is no longer possible. Once collective curiosity is engaged, it does not easily shut down. Questions propagate. Discoveries demand follow-ups. Every solution generates new problems. The system feeds itself. This raises the most unsettling possibility yet. What if the universe is not just responding to curiosity, but amplifying it? What if complexity increases not linearly, but exponentially once certain thresholds are crossed? What if we are not approaching a plateau of understanding, but the steepest part of the curve? If so, then we are no longer just explorers. We are participants in a feedback loop between mind and cosmos. And feedback loops, once unstable, can lead to transformation or collapse. That is the tension we now inhabit. And it leads us directly to the edge, the places where reality itself resists explanation, where models fail, where language breaks down, and where curiosity encounters its most formidable obstacle, the borderlands. There comes a point where curiosity does not lead forward so much as outward, into regions where explanation thins and certainty dissolves. These are the borderlands of understanding, not places on a map, but thresholds in thought. Zones where reality no longer behaves in ways our language can comfortably hold. Every serious inquiry eventually arrives here. In physics, these borderlands appear as singularities, infinities, paradoxes, black holes where equations break, the origin of the universe where time itself seems to lose meaning, quantum phenomena that refuse to be pictured, only calculated. Each one marks a place where our tools still function, but our intuitions fail completely. This is not because reality becomes chaotic at the edges. It is because our models reach the limits of what they can represent. Imagine walking toward the horizon. From a distance, it looks like a clear line, solid, approachable. But no matter how far you walk, you never reach it. The horizon recedes, always just beyond you. Yet it is not an illusion. It structures your entire experience of space. The borderlands of knowledge work the same way. They are real. They shape how understanding unfolds, but they cannot be crossed in the way we expect. They do not yield to force or cleverness. They require a change in how questions are asked. Take the concept of infinity. It appears naturally in mathematics, unavoidable and precise. But when you try to imagine it, the mind stalls. There is no image for endlessness, only symbols, only rules. Infinity exists, but not in a way the senses can grasp. It belongs to a different category of knowing. Or consider the quantum vacuum. It sounds like emptiness, but it seethes with activity. Particles appear and vanish. Energy fluctuates. The nothing beneath everything turns out to be restless, structured, alive with potential. And yet, this activity cannot be directly observed. It is inferred, calculated, trusted. Reality at its edges demands faith of a particular kind. Not belief without evidence, but acceptance without intuition. This is where many people stop. Not because the borderlands are false, but because they feel alien. Because living without mental images, without narrative anchors, without familiar metaphors, is deeply uncomfortable. The mind wants to land. The universe offers only drift. But those who remain in the borderlands begin to notice something strange. The breakdown of old models does not lead to chaos. It leads to new forms of order. Deeper symmetries. More abstract consistencies. The loss of one kind of understanding makes room for another, more general one that is harder to picture, but more powerful. This is how progress actually happens. Not by extending old ideas indefinitely, but by letting them fail at the right moment. Failure, here, is not a mistake. It is a signal. It tells us that curiosity has reached the edge of its current form, that to continue, it must evolve. New concepts, new mathematics, new ways of thinking that feel unnatural at first. This is why the deepest truths often feel wrong when first encountered. They violate intuition. They offend common sense. They demand that we abandon deeply held assumptions about space, time, causality, even existence itself. And yet, once integrated, they feel inevitable. This pattern, approach, breakdown, reconstruction, repeats across every domain of knowledge. It is not unique to science. It appears in art, philosophy, personal growth. Wherever curiosity pushes hard enough, it eventually meets a boundary. And at that boundary, the old self cannot proceed unchanged. This is the deeper meaning of the borderlands. They are not just limits of knowledge, they are limits of identity, because the questions you can ask are shaped by who you are, your assumptions, your language, your tolerance for uncertainty. When curiosity reaches the borderlands, it is not reality that must change first, it is the questioner. This is why the universe feels resistant at the edges. Not hostile, but selective. It does not yield depth to minds that insist on comfort. It requires transformation. And transformation is never gentle. Think about how unsettling it is to realize that causality may not be fundamental, that effects can influence causes, that time may not flow uniformly or at all at the deepest level. These ideas do not just challenge physics textbooks. They challenge how we experience choice, responsibility, and meaning. If time is not fundamental, what does it mean to wait, to regret, to hope? If causality is not absolute, what does it mean to act? The borderlands force these questions not as abstractions, but as lived uncertainties. They seep into philosophy, psychology, and the sense of self. The universe stops being a backdrop and becomes a participant in your inner life. This is why the borderlands are often described with a sense of awe mixed with dread. They feel sacred, not because they are holy, but because they are consequential. You do not leave them unchanged, and perhaps this is their function. Perhaps the universe places its deepest truths at the edges not to hide them, but to ensure that only minds willing to be reshaped can approach them. Not as a test of intelligence, but of resilience, of humility, of patience. In this light, uncertainty is not a flaw in knowledge. It is a gate that filters out those who seek control and allows passage to those who can live with openness. If complexity is the reward for curiosity, then the borderlands are where that reward becomes dangerous. Because beyond them, explanations no longer just describe reality, they redefine what it means to be real. And once you sense that possibility, a final tension begins to form. If the universe reveals deeper structure only at the edges, if understanding requires transformation, then complexity may not just be something you discover, it may be something you become. At a certain depth, the fear begins to change its shape. It no longer feels like standing at the edge of something hostile. It feels more like standing in front of something vast that does not care whether you are ready or not. And strangely, alongside that fear, another sensation appears: quiet, heavy, undeniable awe. This is where complexity stops feeling like an obstacle and starts feeling like a gift. Not a comforting gift, not a generous one, a gift with weight, with teeth. Because complexity at this level does not merely inform you, it alters the way reality feels to inhabit. You begin to notice that the universe is not just complicated, it is expressive. That its laws are not arbitrary, but shaped by constraints that feel almost aesthetic. Symmetries that repeat, patterns that echo across scales, ratios that appear in galaxies, shells, storms, and blood vessels alike. It becomes difficult to believe that all of this is accidental in the shallow sense of the word. And yet, it is equally difficult to believe it was designed for you. This tension is the heart of the experience. The universe feels indifferent to your existence, and yet exquisitely tuned for the emergence of complexity, awareness, and thought. It does not care about you personally, but it cares deeply about structure, about balance, about the conditions under which rich behavior can arise. This is not kindness, it is not cruelty, it is coherence. The more deeply you understand this, the more the universe feels alive, not conscious, not intentional, but dynamically self-consistent. Like a vast equation that does not solve for comfort, but for possibility. And possibility, when taken seriously, is overwhelming. Because possibility implies branching, futures that never happen, worlds that almost were, versions of events that exist only as probabilities. The universe is not a single story unfolding. It is a web of unrealized paths, constantly narrowing, constantly choosing. And you are inside that web. Once you grasp this, simplicity no longer feels honest. Clean explanations begin to feel suspicious. You sense that they are compressions, sacrifices of nuance made for survival, not truth. Reality, as it actually behaves, is layered, conditional, relational. This is the reward curiosity delivers. Not certainty, but intimacy with complexity. You begin to see that every explanation is provisional, that every theory is a lens, not a mirror. That understanding is not about pinning reality down, but about learning how to move within it without tearing the fabric. This changes how you relate to knowledge itself. You stop demanding final answers. You stop expecting closure. You become more interested in consistency than conclusion, in how ideas fit together, not where they end. This is not resignation. It is maturation, like learning to live with another person. At first, you want them to make sense. Later, you accept that depth includes contradiction, that coherence does not require simplicity. The universe, seen this way, is not hiding anything from you. It is offering you as much as you can carry, and capacity matters. Because complexity is heavy. It bends minds the way mass bends space-time. Too much, too quickly, and coherence collapses. Anxiety rises. Meaning fragments. The sense of orientation fails. This is not weakness. It is physics applied to cognition, which may be why complexity arrives gradually. Why each layer must be integrated before the next becomes accessible. Why curiosity is rewarded only when it is sustained, patient, disciplined. The universe does not respond to frantic questioning. It responds to endurance. This reframes the entire journey. The struggle, the confusion, the periods where understanding seems to stall. These are not failures, they are rest points. Places where the system recalibrates, where the mind reorganizes itself to carry more weight. Those who persist through these phases report something unexpected, a deepening calm. Not because the universe becomes less strange, but because strangeness becomes familiar. Uncertainty stops feeling like a threat and starts feeling like a habitat. You begin to trust complexity, not because you understand it fully, but because you understand that it holds together, even when you do not. That the universe does not collapse under scrutiny, it thickens. This is where curiosity becomes less about acquisition and more about alignment. You are no longer trying to extract answers from reality. You are trying to tune yourself to it, to resonate with its structure, to ask questions that fit the depth you are approaching. And this changes how you see yourself. You are no longer a creature standing outside the universe, looking in. You are a pattern within it, capable of reflecting on the very rules that allow you to exist. Your curiosity is not external to the cosmos. It is one of its expressions. This is not romanticism. It is implication. If awareness emerges from complexity, and complexity deepens through inquiry, then curiosity is a feedback loop the universe runs on itself. Consciousness probing its own foundations, structure examining structure, and suddenly, the question shifts. It is no longer, why is the universe so complex? It becomes, what is complexity doing? What function does it serve? Why does reality invest so heavily in layered depth, emergent behavior, and systems that generate more structure the more they are engaged? One answer begins to feel unavoidable. Because complexity allows meaning, not fixed meaning, not universal meaning, but local, lived meaning. Meaning that arises from relationships, from patterns, from the tension between order and uncertainty. A simple universe could exist, but nothing within it could matter. Meaning requires depth, and depth requires complexity. So perhaps the universe rewards curiosity with complexity because complexity is the only environment where meaning can survive. But meaning is fragile. It depends on perspective, on context, on interpretation. It can be distorted, weaponized, lost, and as complexity increases, so does the risk of confusion, of fragmentation, of misalignment. Which brings us to a quiet but urgent realization. If complexity is the reward, then responsibility grows with it, because to engage deeply with reality is not just to understand more. It is to influence how meaning is constructed, shared, and lived. And at a certain level, that influence extends beyond the individual. It becomes collective. And collective meaning, once destabilized, reshapes civilizations. That is the weight we are now carrying. And it leads us to the final turn before the end. If curiosity unlocks complexity, and complexity generates meaning, then the question is no longer what the universe is doing. The question is what we will do with the depth it has already revealed. There is a moment, subtle but irreversible, when curiosity stops being personal and becomes ethical. When the depth you've entered is no longer just something you carry inside your own mind, but something that shapes how you act, how you speak, how you influence others. Meaning, once uncovered, does not stay contained, it radiates. This is where the human thread tightens, because no one explores reality alone. Every insight is inherited, translated, distorted, passed on. Every question you ask stands on centuries of previous questions. Every model you trust was built by hands you will never know. Curiosity at scale is a collective inheritance and a collective responsibility. The deeper our understanding becomes, the more power it confers. Not power in the dramatic sense, but in the quiet, structural sense. The power to frame reality, to decide which explanations feel legitimate, to choose which uncertainties are tolerated and which are erased, to shape the stories societies tell themselves about who they are and where they are going. This is where complexity becomes dangerous, because complex systems are sensitive. Small changes can cascade. Interpretations harden into ideologies. Partial truths masquerade as final answers. And the very depth that once generated awe can be compressed into certainty, weaponized against nuance. History is filled with examples of this collapse. Moments when deep insights were simplified too aggressively, stripped of their uncertainty, and turned into dogma. When curiosity was replaced by conviction, when questions were frozen into answers and enforced. The universe does not resist complexity, but it does resist rigidity. Complex systems require flexibility to remain stable. They survive through feedback, adaptation, correction. When that flexibility is lost, collapse follows. Not because the system is weak, but because it has become brittle. This applies to knowledge as much as it applies to ecosystems, economies, and minds. As understanding deepens, the temptation to declare finality grows. To say, now we know. To close the loop. To rest. But reality does not reward that move. It punishes it quietly, through anomalies, contradictions, and crises that refuse to be ignored. This is why the most resilient forms of understanding are not those that claim certainty, but those that remain open, that carry their own doubt within them, that treat knowledge as provisional, evolving, alive. Curiosity, when mature, learns restraint. It learns when to press and when to pause, when to question and when to listen, when to accept that some answers cannot yet be lived responsibly. This is not anti-knowledge. It is reverence for depth, because depth changes people. As complexity increases, you begin to notice that many of the questions you once thought were about the universe are actually about values, about what matters, about what should be preserved, about what kind of future is being implied by the models we build and the technologies we deploy. Understanding is never neutral. Every framework highlights some aspects of reality and hides others. Every lens carries bias, not because it is flawed, but because it must select. To see anything clearly, something else must fall into shadow. The danger is not bias itself. The danger is forgetting that bias exists. At high levels of complexity, forgetting this becomes catastrophic. Systems become self-justifying. Feedback loops close. Dissent is dismissed as ignorance rather than signal. And curiosity, the very force that unlocked depth in the first place, is quietly strangled. The universe does not respond kindly to that. When curiosity collapses into certainty, complexity does not disappear. It reasserts itself through failure, through surprise, through consequences no one predicted because no one allowed themselves to imagine them. This is not punishment. It is correction. The universe does not enforce meaning. It enforces consistency, and consistency demands humility. This brings us back to the human experience, to the quiet moments when you sit alone with what you've learned and feel the weight of it. The realization that understanding more does not make life easier. It makes it more demanding, more fragile, more precious. You begin to sense that the purpose of curiosity is not to dominate reality, but to enter into a deeper relationship with it. One that requires care, one that acknowledges limits, one that recognizes that not everything that can be known should be simplified for convenience. This is the maturity of inquiry, and it is rare, because it requires holding complexity without rushing to resolve it. It requires living with questions that never fully settle. It requires allowing uncertainty to coexist with meaning. But those who reach this place often describe something remarkable, a quiet alignment. The feeling that, despite the absence of final answers, life makes more sense, not because it is explained, but because it is engaged honestly. That meaning is not something imposed on the universe, but something that emerges through participation in its depth. You stop asking what the universe owes you. You start asking what it is asking of you. This is where curiosity returns to something like innocence, but a deeper one. Not ignorance, but openness. Not certainty, but trust. Trust that complexity is not hostile, that it is not trying to confuse you, that it is inviting you to grow into a form of understanding that can coexist with mystery. And now, standing here, with all this depth behind us, the final question begins to take shape. If the universe rewards curiosity with complexity, and complexity generates meaning, and meaning demands responsibility, what does the universe become when you understand it? And what do you become in return? What do you become after you understand? Not after you learn facts, not after you collect explanations, but after reality has reshaped the way you see, the way you doubt, the way you stand inside existence itself. This is the last door, and it does not open outward. It opens inward. By now, something subtle has already changed. You may not be able to name it, but you can feel it. The universe no longer feels like a backdrop. It feels close, intimate, not friendly, not hostile, present, as if you are no longer looking at reality from the outside, but listening from within it. This is the quiet consequence of deep curiosity. When you first began asking questions, you wanted answers, you wanted clarity, you wanted the world to settle. But the deeper you went, the more you realized that understanding does not settle reality. It unsettles the one who understands. It loosens the grip of rigid beliefs. It softens the demand for certainty. It replaces the need to be right with the need to remain open. This is not weakness. It is adaptation. The universe you now sense is not simpler than the one you started with. It is far more complex. But it is also more honest, less edited, less compressed for comfort. You no longer expect the universe to explain itself in human terms. You allow it to be larger than your intuitions. And in doing so, something unexpected happens. The fear begins to dissolve, not because the universe is no longer strange, but because strangeness no longer feels like a threat. You begin to recognize that uncertainty is not a gap to be closed, but a space to be lived in. That meaning does not require final answers, only coherence, continuity, and care. This is where the journey resolves, not into a conclusion, but into a stance. You understand now that the universe does not reward curiosity with truth in the way we once imagined. It rewards it with complexity because complexity is the only environment in which growth is possible. Simplicity is static. Complexity is alive. A simple universe would be complete, but nothing within it could change. A complex universe is never finished, and neither are you. This reframes everything you once feared, the endless questions, the lack of closure, the sense that every answer only opens another door. These are not signs of failure. They are signs that reality is not a puzzle meant to be solved and put away. It is a landscape meant to be walked, again and again, from new angles, with deeper awareness each time. And you are not separate from that landscape. Your curiosity is not an anomaly. It is a continuation. The same force that drives matter to organize, stars to ignite, life to emerge, and minds to awaken. Curiosity is the universe folding back on itself, asking what it is through you. That does not make you important in a cosmic sense. It makes you relevant, because relevance is not about size or permanence. It is about participation. You now see that every act of understanding is also an act of responsibility, to simplify carefully, to doubt honestly, to resist the temptation of premature certainty, to remember that every model leaves something out, and that what is left out still matters. This is the ethical dimension of knowledge, not rules imposed from outside, but restraint grown from depth. The understanding that power without humility collapses systems, that insight without empathy fractures meaning, that curiosity without care becomes extraction. The universe does not stop you from doing these things. It lets you learn from the consequences. And perhaps that is the final lesson hidden beneath all this complexity. That reality is not a teacher who gives answers, but a system that responds. Gently at first, then firmly, always consistently, always reminding you, through structure rather than instruction, what holds together and what does not. You may never know whether the universe is aware of this process, whether it knows that curiosity unlocks deeper layers, whether this unfolding is intentional or inevitable, but you do not need to know that. What matters is that you can feel it. You can feel that the universe you inhabit now is deeper than the one you started in, that your questions have weight, that your attention matters, that the way you look at the world changes the kind of world you experience. This is not mysticism. It is consequence. The more you learn, the more reality reveals. Not because it is generous, but because revelation is what happens when structure meets sustained inquiry, when patterns are allowed to emerge rather than forced into conclusions. And so, the final door does not lead to an answer. It leads to a way of being, a way of standing inside uncertainty without collapsing, of holding complexity without demanding it become simple, of continuing to ask, not because you expect an ending, but because asking itself is how you remain aligned with a universe that is still unfolding. If the universe rewards curiosity with complexity, then the reward is not knowledge. The reward is becoming the kind of mind that can live truthfully inside an unfinished world. And perhaps that is the only reward that was ever possible. The questions will continue, the layers will deepen, and you, changed, quieter, more attentive, will be capable of walking forward without needing the ground to stop moving beneath your feet. This is where the documentary ends, not because the inquiry is complete, but because now it belongs to you.